listening to episode 207 of Mitolife Radio. I am Matt Blackburn, your host, and today is a solo show about ketosis. This is something that I experimented with about 5 years ago, and I felt phenomenal, and it seemed really sustainable. I seemed very mentally clear, energetic, slept great, had high testosterone, as was measured by Inside Tracker. I was incredibly lean and had significant muscle mass. Fast forward to the last couple years, and a lot of that went downhill. And this is while doing everything, quote unquote, right. I was moving more where it's impossible. Where I live, I'm forced to go outside, whether it's shoveling snow or tending to the farm, carrying buckets, carrying bales of hay, carrying heavy bags of chicken feed. Whatever it is, I'm forced to move. And that's been my life the last 2 to 3 years. And while I was doing that, I was fueling myself with all three macronutrients. So carbohydrates, protein, and fat. My idea was all diets are fad diets. Let's just get back to balance and basically eat a balanced ratio of the three macronutrients. So the whole concept with prometabolic eating is that you're supposed to balance the carbs with protein. And if you eat a bunch of carbohydrates without enough protein, then the idea goes that you will gain weight, you will trash your metabolism, and you will have all these negative effects. And so I was very aware of that and very aware of how many grams of protein I was getting every day while I was consuming sourdough bread, generally a slice every morning for breakfast, with pastured eggs, a glass of raw goat milk kind of throughout the day. I had been eating a hefty amount of potatoes, well cooked with lots of butter and salt, and pasta with ground meat in there, generally once a week max. That's been my average the last couple of years. And I would force myself to eat 3 meals a day, even if I wasn't hungry, because supposedly that was going to fix my metabolism. And all that did was make me excessively hungrier, to where in between meals, I was getting to the point where I could only last a few hours before having to at least have like an energy bar, venison jerky, gelatin gummies, something like that to keep going. The time in between meals that I could go was getting shorter and shorter before I would get hangry, cranky, mental faculties would go downhill very quickly, and I wouldn't be able to function mentally. So I was essentially becoming more reliant on this external source of energy to live sustainably and be able to actually leave the house and live my life without constantly thinking about when my next meal was going to be. So this crescendoed when I started to experience memory loss. So I have a locking gate here on my farm, and I kept forgetting the code. And that was very frightening for me because I never forget things like codes and numbers, things like that. That's never happened to me in my life. And it happened multiple times within the span of a few months. So my initial thought was iron deficiency, interviewing Caitlin Hardigan and researching the symptoms of non-anemia iron deficiency, which I had/have. And that does include memory loss. But I think that perfectly coincided with this high carb diet that I had done for the last couple of years. My memory was at least 10 times as good when I was 100% vegan, fasting for 23 hours a day with a 1 hour eating window. So thinking back on that, I started to think, how can I change things up? If what I'm doing isn't working for me now, what could I do to change things up to get back to where I used to be, to where my memory was on point? I was more creative. I had more mental energy. And ever since then, adding a substantial amount of carbohydrates to my diet, it's been a slow downward spiral. And now someone could say, how do you know that it was the pro-metabolic lifestyle that did that to you? Could it have been cod liver oil? I saw you sipping from the bottle. You're megadosing preformed vitamin A. That probably messed you up. Or maybe taking this or that supplement in, high doses for 1 month messed you up. It's a really interesting aspect of human psychology, and I think it's a projection that people send onto others when they hear about someone's condition or their experience of some health journey that they're going on, whether it's serious or mild, in the case of mine. And they project all their ideas of what they think happened to you. And that is the absolute height of arrogance. And I think one of the ugliest aspects of humanity. Those people are not you. They didn't experience what you experienced. So there's a lot of assumptions that have to be made to dial it in to one or two specific things that caused X condition. And that's simply impossible from an outsider's perspective, even if the two people are living together, because they're still different people. So my point is, you have to figure it out yourself. You can definitely listen to others that are not psycho, that are respectful, that are not just projecting their fears and insecurities onto you. There could definitely be some valid input and things that you can integrate into your life. And sometimes it's not even what people tell you. Sometimes it's just an intuitive gut feeling. And that occurred to me recently with a continuous glucose monitor, CGM. These have been around for several years. A lot of biohackers have shared that they're using one and how much of a help it's been in their health journey of understanding their body and how it works better and how it responds to different foods and different meals. And I've really been blown away by how accurately it reflects my mental capability, my stability of mood, my stability of energy, lockstep, exact reflection based on the app. And the less peaks and dives there are, the less spikes there are, the better I've felt. And there's arguments, as you know, about every little thing on the internet as it relates to human health. And a lot of people bash these because they say that they're not accurate, or they're not as accurate as the finger prick glucose tests. With wearable technology, whether it's the Oura Ring, the Apple Watch, the CGM by levels, whatever it is, all of these are not 100% accurate. But do they have to be, is the question. I don't think so, because a lot of people, myself included, have benefited from doing different experiments using the Oura Ring, because you can do something before bed and then see the sleep stages that you were in and roughly how long you were in them, and then do something different the next night and see if it improves. And I've done that multiple times, and it was very helpful data to see that actually as numbers instead of just an idea in my head of maybe this will do this. And I think the same thing about the CGM. I would have gone probably several more years of having declining mental health and a poor metabolism and energy dips and not optimal sleep if I didn't get the CGM, because I wouldn't know that I'm having these wild glucose spikes throughout the day. And it's not necessarily that we're trying to flatten the line. We're not trying to get no spikes in glucose, because that will happen inevitably after you eat a meal. But it shouldn't stay elevated for 2 hours like mine has at a very, very high level. Eating a meal that contains a balance of carbs, animal protein, and fat. So I've been really enjoying the Levels Health blog on what should your glucose levels be, the ultimate guide to healthy blood sugar ranges. One of the bullet points of the article is based on the data of healthy individuals wearing continuous glucose monitor. It appears that it is safe and healthy to strive for a fasting glucose between 72 to 85 milligrams per deciliter, a post-meal glucose level of 110 milligrams per deciliter or lower, and an average glucose of 100 milligrams per deciliter or lower. All three of my numbers for those are chronically elevated. And then it goes on to say post-meal glucose levels are also meaningful, and high post-meal glucose levels can worsen glucose control over time and lead to obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, impaired exercise, and cognitive performance. While it is not unexpected for glucose levels to increase after a meal, as the glucose from the meal is released into the blood, if this level is too high, it is not good for health and can predispose one to disease over time. According to the International Diabetes Federation, the IDF, guidelines for managing post-meal glucose levels, non-diabetic people should have a glucose level of no higher than 140 milligrams per deciliter after meals, and glucose should return to pre-meal levels within 2 to 3 hours. Post-meal hyperglycemia, elevated glucose, is defined as a glucose level of more than 140 milligrams per deciliter 1 to 2 hours after the ingestion of food or drinks. And so I check all those boxes. My post-meal glucose is way higher than 140, actually above 200 after meals. And it took often over 3 hours for it to go back to normal levels. So what that implies is not only prediabetes, but insulin resistance to a pretty severe degree. In short, the pro-metabolic lifestyle, whatever you want to call it, did not work for me. Carbohydrates in that high of amounts did not work for me. I'm not saying they won't work for you, but there's no lifestyle or way of eating that's going to work for everybody. And the same goes for nutritional supplements. You have to look at genetics. You have to look at all these various factors. And it's really interesting to watch people individualize supplements, but then in the same breath say that everyone has to eat balanced macronutrient ratios, carb, protein, and fat with every single meal to have a healthy metabolism. That's just not true. I won't bring up many studies during this podcast just because everyone loves battling with studies. You can find a study to support whatever you're saying because they have different variables, and going back and forth with studies, in my opinion, is just a total waste of time. But here's one study. Restricting carbohydrates at breakfast is sufficient to reduce 24-hour exposure to postprandial hyperglycemia and improve glycemic variability. Chang 2019 et al. So this study really caught my eye because generally breakfast is a huge sugar bomb, tons of carbohydrates. You have your milk and or orange juice, you have fruit. That's a lot of grams of carbohydrates generally in someone's breakfast. And so for this study to prove that not only throughout the day, but for the next 24 hours, it stabilized blood glucose is pretty phenomenal. Because in this study, they actually ate a, quote, balanced lunch and dinner with carbs being 55%, 30% fat, 15% protein. But the breakfast was the meal where they had no carbohydrates, and it had this big of an effect. So I've been playing with this a lot and only consuming fat and protein for breakfast. And it's made a tremendous difference in everything: energy levels, mood, mental clarity, sleep. I'm remembering my dreams almost every single night, where before I was averaging 1 or 2 dreams a year. This is the data that really fascinates me because, like I said, you can go back and forth for eternity with randomized control clinical trials. There's no one perfect study. Therefore, there's no one conclusion that we can take and live our life off of. They're interesting. They're useful. They're definitely worth looking at. But I think it's really important to realize that your personal experience trumps every scientific study. And it really depends what your goals are. My personal goal is longevity. And I know that memory loss is a hallmark of aging. So when I started experiencing that, made me question the whole bioenergetic, pro-metabolic lifestyle that I've been living for the last couple of years, and whether that was conducive to my health. So I'd like to cover 2 main areas as it relates to a ketogenic diet, and that is thyroid health and cortisol, whether it increases stress hormones like cortisol. So let's start with thyroid. This is a myth that I believed the last couple of years, that if you restrict carbohydrate intake, thyroid function will decline. I was very surprised to learn that Dr. Broda Barnes, the author of Hypothyroidism, the Unsuspected Illness, this is kind of like the Bible for Ray Peters. He had a PhD in thyroid biochemistry, and he researched hypothyroidism, cold intolerance, heat intolerance, weight loss, weight gain, high and low blood pressure. In the 1970s, he estimated that 40% of the population was relatively hypothyroid. And the diet that he suggested was 70 grams of protein, 90 grams of fat, and 50 grams of carbohydrate. So that is the definition of a keto or ketogenic diet. Lately, I've been questioning whether low T3 is a bad thing. Here's a quote from a study from 2007 from Journal of Neurobiology and Aging. Our data revealed several differences in the neuroendocrine and metabolic status of centenarians compared with other age groups, including the lowest serum concentrations of leptin, insulin, and T3, and the highest levels for prolactin. I found a really interesting observational study in the Journal of Gerontology. It's called Low Serum Free Triiodothyronine Levels Mark Familial Longevity, the Leiden Longevity Study. And just the introduction is really great. It says, the hypothalamo-pituitary thyroid axis has been widely implicated in modulating the aging process. Life extension effects associated with low thyroid hormone levels have been reported in multiple animal models. In neonatal rats, induction of hypothyroidism results in a moderate extension of lifespan. Similarly, low thyroid hormone levels are characteristic of murine pituitary mutants with delayed aging. Long-lived Ames and Snell dwarf mice show traits that are hypothesized to be related to thyroid hormone deficiency, including hypothermia and delayed maturation. Administration of thyroid hormone during adulthood partly diminishes longevity in Snell dwarf mice. Another very long-living mammal, the naked mole rat, also has very low serum thyroxine levels. So in this study, they looked at 420 families where the men were 89 years or older and the women were 91 years or older. That was the required criteria to enter the study. And they found that low thyroid hormone metabolism was beneficial for longevity in humans. And the low T3 is hypothesized to be part of the mechanism in increasing lifespan. Another common argument against the keto diet is cortisol, that to make your own glucose via gluconeogenesis, the myth is that that requires cortisol, the stress hormone, to be elevated. If you've never heard of a hormone called glucagon, that is the primary hormone responsible for regulating blood sugar, then it would be very easy to fall for this myth that gluconeogenesis to create glucose requires elevated cortisol. That is false. When blood sugar begins to tank, glucagon is created. And that is what enacts gluconeogenesis, where our liver will make glucose using precursors such as glycerol, lactate, pyruvate, and amino acids. The threshold for cortisol production starting is lower than the threshold for glucagon, meaning our body will use glucagon first to regulate blood sugar. And if the blood sugar falls to a low enough level, actually to a level of hypoglycemia, only then will cortisol be increased. But it's not the first choice of the body to use cortisol to regulate blood sugar. And if someone is experiencing hypoglycemia to where they have to tap into that cortisol, it's still better to restrict carbohydrates and to make sure that they're eating adequate protein. I found an interesting study called The Advantage of a High Protein Diet in the Treatment of Spontaneous Hypoglycemia. It's from Jerome W. Kahn, 1936. And it had a really interesting case study. A 32-year-old housewife complained of faintness and weakness, occasionally accompanied by convulsions and unconscious spells. She's had 35 to 40 convulsive attacks, and very low blood sugar values were found during those attacks. She frequently returned to a normal state within a few minutes after glucose was given either intravenously or by mouth. And so it goes on to where they try different macronutrient ratios for her. And it says a relatively high carbohydrate diet had failed to affect improvement and had made the patient worse. A low carbohydrate, high fat diet consisting of 60 grams of protein, 250 grams of fat, and 100 grams of carbohydrate, divided into 5 or 6 equal feedings, improved the symptoms and reduced the frequency of attacks, but the patient was not relieved of these episodes. The patient was instructed to use a diet containing 110 grams of protein, so almost double of the previous diet, 150 grams of fat, and 50 grams of carbohydrate. So that's half of the 100 grams they used in her previous diet, and 50 grams or less is the definition of a keto diet, yielding a total of 2,000 calories. It says it was felt from the experience with experimental periods that the glucose would be delivered slowly over a sufficiently prolonged period to allow freedom from attacks, even if only 3 meals a day were given. The diet, therefore, was divided into 3 equal meals to be taken at the usual times. So that's half the feedings of the high carbohydrate previous diet. And it says more than 3 months have elapsed. The patient has had no convulsions. She reports that she has felt better in all respects. She no longer has the periods of faintness, weakness, restlessness, and trembling complained of during the years of treatment with other dietary plans. So once again, study after study after study, case study, observational study, meta-analyses. We can throw these out here for infinity. And there are a million podcasts that do. That gets a little old, so I try to switch it up on this one and provide a lot of anecdotes, a lot of personal experience that I've had with loved ones, family, friends, direct experience with changing things that might appear to be controversial and contradictory. So I encourage you to experiment. I encourage you to take inventory of your memory, your dream recall, your quality of sleep, your ability to go long periods in between meals, which will happen because we're human beings and stuff happens and we can't eat 3 square meals a day, all day, every day, forever. It's just not sustainable with things coming up in life, and something happens here and there, and we have to adapt. And to me, health is about adaptation. And the eating style that I was doing, the quote, Prometabolic way, was decreasing my adaptability. Also, I encourage you to count how many grams of carbohydrates that you're consuming every day. I was shocked to learn that 1 slice of sourdough bread contains almost 40 grams of carbohydrates. And 1 cup of goat milk contains 11 grams of carbohydrates. So when you add all of this up for breakfast, we're getting this huge bolus dose, this mega dose of carbohydrate right at the very start of the day. And that's the opposite of what that study showed the benefit is for regulating blood sugar. And I've been doing this for the last several years, eating about 50 grams of carbohydrates balanced with protein and fat. And that wrecked my blood sugar stability as measured by my levels CGM. And it does correlate exactly with how I feel. Lately, I've been keeping my carbohydrates under 20 to 30 grams a day, which is very low. Usually for ketosis, they see between 30 and 50 grams a day. But I'm feeling better the closer I get that number to 0. And I do think there is a lot of validity to carb cycling. And even if just for social and eating out with your family or loved ones, it's really important to break the rules and let loose and eat, 150 or 200 grams of carbohydrates. I'm going to continue monitoring my blood glucose and seeing if I can handle a huge pasta meal better in the future versus now where my blood glucose stays elevated for 3 hours, even having adequate protein with it. So much more to come. I'll have a lot of podcast episodes on all of the little aspects of ketosis, gluconeogenesis, intermittent fasting, carb restriction, because I have some really interesting questions to ask since I've been on the other side of the quote, balanced nutrition lifestyle. So if you want to dive more into my work, you can head over to matt-blackburn.com. I have the CLF protocol up there. That stands for calcification, lipofuscin, and fibrosis. And these are 3 accumulations over the course of our lifetime that decrease our lifespan, decrease our quality of life, and decrease our ability to function optimally. If you click on shop, you can see all of my recommended products. I have my favorite espresso machine up there, my favorite water machines, ozone machine, Rife machines, and most of them have discount codes so you can save a little bit of money with trying them out. If you go to mitolife.co, that is my brand Mitolife. We have grounding sheets, a water filter in the works that you can put under your kitchen sink. It's a 7-stage water filter that's open source, so you don't have to come back to us to buy the filter cartridges. The newest product is vitamin C with polyphenols. I still pop 4 at a time. That's 1.2 grams. And ascorbic acid has been phenomenal for me while I'm restricting carbohydrates, because you really have to make sure that you're getting enough minerals, especially as you're transitioning from being a sugar burner to being a fat burner in your mitochondria. There is definitely a transition phase there. They call it keto flu, keto rash. There's a million things that can happen. Brain fog, lethargy, just not feeling good. So what's been helping me since I've been transitioning from sugar to fat is utilizing electrolytes, potassium citrate, magnesium, sodium. I pop Kintone, different electrolyte powders, keeping my amino acids up, especially essential amino acids, and vitamin C. Those 3 things, the EAAs, the electrolytes, and vitamin C, have really helped me to transition away from sugar to a more sustainable energy source, cleaner burning energy source, which is fat. So check out the Mitolife Academy on YouTube. I have some great videos and a live coming up at the end of this month. That is the private school. It's $15 a month, and you can gain access to the previous 2 years of content. It's really priceless with all of the videos I put out. A lot of them are 30, 40 minutes long. And there's a new episode released for this podcast every Friday. So I'll see you guys next week. Stay supercharged.